I want to talk to you about one thing today, and that's learning. And I want you to consider one thing in particular. I want you to think about one thing that you want to learn. That might be as a student, as a high school teacher, as a working professional like some of us here. It might be a sport, a hobby, a language, anything. And with that one thing, I want you to hold on to that for the remainder of this talk, okay? About a year ago, I realized I wasn't exercising enough, so I took up the challenge of learning racket sports. Now, alongside the challenge of being genuinely useless at hitting a ball, I experienced this genuine question, which was, are the strategies I'm using to learn this sport the most effective? So with that thing that you're considering, whatever it might be, a hobby, a sport, a language, even just cooking, do you know what causes you to remember something? Do you know what helps you learn from failure with that thing that you want to learn? And do you know how to teach yourself something and become an expert with no one else helping you? And for all of that, can you base that and justify your methods using science? Now, the reality of which is that many of us leave schooling with not much clarity and ideas about how we learn and about what is it makes us effective learners. So I want to talk about two main things today. The first is that we don't fully understand how we learn. The second is some strategies that we can use to improve our learning based in science. So as an aside to illustrate this first point, 150 years ago, astronomical sciences were quite basic. We knew little more than our solar system, and the technology we used was very, very simple. If we fast forward to today, well, we've already landed people on the moon more than once, we've landed people on Mars more than once, and we're about to launch the most advanced telescope in human history that can look back billions of years. And I don't need to go much further than just mentioning medicine to consider the science fiction era that we live in terms of medical marvels and medical technology compared to where we were 150 years ago. So how does it stand for education and learning? Well, about 150 years ago, we began the first experiments in what we call universal education for all. And these are loosely based on the factory system, they often call it, with a focus on efficiency. So students in year groupings and timetables. And the church system with the priest or teacher at the front telling people what to know. And these practices that were being used were not much based in science, and there was virtually no neuroscience behind the approaches. So where are we now? Well, first off, the reality is we know a lot more. The factory system might be with us to some extent, if you want to call it that, but we've made so much progress in terms of the science of learning, but yet there's so much we don't know. I was quite shocked to discover from my university lecturer when I first became a school teacher that in her view, education was among the worst fields in terms of the quality of research being done. That the quality of research into schooling, teaching, and learning was far worse than what you would find in other fields of research. Now, that's no particular blame. That's for a range of reasons. For example, it's hard to get consent. 2, the experiments are experimenting with people's lives. There are so many variables to consider, and also we just don't prioritize funding into education and schooling and learning-based research as compared to other fields like medicine. So first off, I just want to highlight that we still know very little about how humans learn best. That you might not know very much about how you learn best. So I want to move into, rather than just slagging on education for the quality of research or which we can question, I want to go into what we do know. So I want a little bit of interaction from all of you right now. I want you to put your hands up in terms of you. What type of learning style are you? So when you put your hands up, if you're the type of learner who learns best when you receive information visually. All right. What about kinesthetic or in a physical way? What if it's auditory, you can hear it? Some of you are a bit of all of those three, all right. And what about this? Hands up if you think that exams and testing are a dated method of learning that need to change. All right, a lot of consensus on that one. Let's get rid of exams, love it. And what about this? Do you think that reviewing, rereading, and highlighting are effective study methods? Some mixed views on that, all right. So what do we know? Well, the reality of the current science is everything I said is just false. Learning styles are a myth, they don't exist. You are not a visual learner. We are all visual learners in some extent. Exams and testing definitely have their problems, but regular testing is still a proven learning method, and there are much better methods than just rereading something, okay? Now, in terms of learning style, the reality is there is no evidence in favor of learning styles. For all we know, all humans share the same fundamental learning algorithm. That's from the French cognitive scientist Dehaene. What he's essentially saying is that we all learn in the same fundamental way. We share the same neurological processes with mammals, birds, even fish. That if we better understand the fundamentals of how our neurological processes work, then we can better understand how all of us can learn more effectively. So much of what I'm about to present comes from these two texts, Make It Stick and How We Learn, both exploring the science of learning, and the studies associated with those two texts. I would also highlight that I'm not a cognitive scientist. I don't have a PhD in neurology or educational research. I'm a school teacher, and I'm someone who's passionate about this, and therefore I'm pursuing a better understanding of this because I think it's something we ignore far too often. So first off, I'm going to go through essentially a whole bunch of science. I apologize if it's a lot, but I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. The first off is, what is learning, okay? Well, your brain is made up of neural pathways. Any thought or action that you do activates a set of neural pathways. If a neural pathway is activated repeatedly, that neural connection becomes stronger. So when you learn something for the first time, in other words, you're creating a neural connection inside your brain between 2 points. And if you use it repeatedly, that connection becomes stronger. Essentially, learning is the construction and rewiring of neural pathways inside your brain. It is a physical thing inside your head. Therefore, though you'd like to think that learning should be easy, the research shows the opposite. When your mind has to work, learning sticks better. Essentially, learning that requires effort is effective learning. Just like lifting weights is hard, effective learning is also hard. So I'm going to go through 4 main strategies I've picked out from some of this research. It's not all of it, but it's 4 that we can use as a starting point for how we might reconsider how we approach learning. The first is this idea of space retrieval. When you experience something for the first time, it goes into what we call your sensory memory, and then it goes into your working memory if you use it. But if you do nothing with that information, it's going to fade away. It'll disappear. But let's say the next day you recall something you remembered a few days ago, and then the day after that, and then the day after that. Gradually, you're going to solidify that into long-term memory. So what does this look like in practice? Well, they did one study with high school students learning French. They had them to learn French vocabulary, one group by doing a 10-minute lesson each day for 3 days. The other group doing the same lessons, but all back together on a single day over 30 minutes. 7 days later, they gave them an unannounced test. Which group did better? The group that did space practice, spreading their learning over multiple days, by a far point did a lot better. And this is shown again and again and again, the same thing in research, that when we spread out learning, it leads to better retention. And that the effort for you to recall something, even if it's hard that you've almost forgotten, helps to strengthen that neural pathway. Furthermore, it's not just the effort, it's something else. We've already seen that learning is much more efficient when we spread out the learning. The reason is simple. Every night, your brain consolidates your learning and what it's done during the day. This is one of the most important neuroscience discoveries of the last 30 years, which is as follows. While you sleep, your brain remains active, translating effective learning into a more efficient compartment of your memory. In other words, spaced retrieval of memory strengthens that neural network for that learning, and good, healthy sleep consolidates your learning. So your parents are correct. Go to bed early, please. So, in addition to this, or just to expand on this, in the words of Pooja Agarwal, learning is not getting information into your head, learning is getting information out of your head. Essentially, learning that is not used is not learned. And I don't mean testing or exams when I say space retrieval or reaching and recalling something. Any method that you use that requires you to use something you previously learned counts. Consider this baseball team study. They had a team do massed practice where they had to do a set of baseball batting. They wanted to improve their baseball batting, okay? And they got one set of 15 fastballs back to back, and they hit 15 fastballs. Then they did one set of curveballs, 15 curveballs, and then one set of 15 change-ups. Twice a week for 6 weeks. And during practice, they were able to refine their skill and get much better at performing well to those different pitches or throws. What was the results after 6 weeks? Well, as we expect, all players showed an improvement. Great, the science is true. Lovely. Well, what about the other half of the team? What did they do? Well, they just gave them an entirely random sequence of 45 pitches, the same types of balls, the same number, but in the order was completely randomized. What did it feel like? Well, it was just frustrating. They made lots of errors, they did not perform as well, they didn't know what was coming, and it was just a difficult time. Who did better? The group that had the random sequence that constantly made mistakes did much better in the actual performance 6 weeks later. Why did it work? Relatively simple. The next strategy I want to present to you is what we call interleaving and variation. The first half of the team did what we call massed practice, which is kind of how I learnt maths when I was at school. The other half of the team did interleaving, which is much more effective. This is essentially when you mix up closely related concepts once you have learned them. Don't make it hard on yourself. Learn it first and then mix it up. Here's another study to illustrate the point. They had children throw beanbags 3 feet away. Just do it over and over again, 3 feet. They had another group throw beanbags every possible distance except 3 feet away. What's your challenge? Just throw it 3 feet away. Who's going to do better? The group who are doing the same thing over and over again, or those who are changing it up? Those who won were those who never threw the beanbag 3 feet away. The reason why is because their varied practice improved their skill at taking the learning from one situation and applying it to another. In order to throw the beanbag different distances, they were making micro adjustments, which improved their accuracy overall. Essentially, learning that is not effective when you put it in a small box by itself. Learning that is connected to other learning is powerful learning. Furthermore, so what do we know from this overall? So, what I've told you so far is 1, learning is a physical action inside your head. Effective learning is spread out over time, connected to other learning, and it requires effort, which is why the third strategy I want to present to you is embracing difficulties and reflecting. So already the science shows us that if you embrace errors and correct them, that leads to effective learning. Even if you're doing, say, this space practice with interleaving by mixing up related learning and you make a lot of mistakes, if you correct that, though, that leads to effective learning. But it goes further than just this. Consider, well, actually going back to the last point, about those children, the mistakes that you make in your practice and they made in their practice are adjusting and refining their skill and being better at applying that learning in different circumstances. Essentially, to make 0 mistakes leads to ineffective learning. It goes further than this. Consider the story of Captain Sully. He was an American pilot doing a routine flight over New York City. And just as he was leaving, suddenly the engines collapsed. They stopped working. And in the matter of the next 3 to 4 minutes, he crash landed, or shall we say, safely landed the plane into a river in the middle of the city. He was able to do that because he'd spent thousands of hours mastering the art of being a pilot, but also because he did one thing that all of us can apply in our learning, which is to mentally rehearse and review your learning. Professionals across multiple fields do this all the time. Sully was doing it as a pilot to prepare for possible problems. A professional kayaker doing a difficult maneuver prepares for a difficult maneuver by mentally rehearsing what could go wrong. A chess champion before and after chess matches is rehearsing different games and different approaches. Or just you trying to master that fancy French omelette that's rather tricky. To mentally rehearse and review your learning helps to consolidate that learning and create what they call mental models to apply it in different circumstances. So, just to add to this, consider this list of random digits. There's 501 digits there, okay? About 8 years ago, Johannes Marlow, a world memorization competitor, went to a competition about memorization, and he won the competition. What he did was he was given a random list of numbers. He sat down for 5 minutes and tried to memorize as many of them, and after 5 minutes, he was able to recite 501 digits in perfect order without a single mistake. Now, the reality is, and the extraordinary part, is that we currently don't know how much you can learn. There's no known limit. But I don't want to discuss how much you can learn. I want to discuss how we are learning. So for Marlow, he was able to do that because he used very precise strategies to improve how much he could learn in the time that he had. Which is why the fourth and last strategy I want to cover is high quality encoding of learning, or shall we say high quality thinking in your learning. Consider this Bloom's taxonomy. It's a hierarchy of learning. Lower down, less complex thinking. Higher up, more complex thinking. Just to recall something, say space retrieval, is actually fairly low in terms of complexity of thinking, whereas we want to aim for things higher up on that list. One thing that comes again and again in people who discuss what effective learning looks like based on science, they talk about elaboration. Elaboration is to process your learning, make sense of it, and relate it to prior learning. In other words, let's see this in practice. So say you're wanting to learn about nutrition, so you're reading Michael Pollan. The typical approach is you finish a part of the book, you do nothing with that, and you're probably going to forget a lot of it. But say we want to apply these principles. So we finish the first part of the book, we space out a self-check over the next week, and we want to apply some elaboration. So we elaborate on what we've learned by explaining it written or verbally. We elaborate by writing down what you remember and checking, teaching it to someone else, or simplifying it. And with all of that, varying the different concepts we're covering. So, what am I saying? Effective learning is more than just remembering something. Effective learning is elaborating or mentally rehearsing different approaches, elaborating on what you know, reflecting on how it went, and applying it in new situations. So, lastly, let's consider you're learning tennis, for example, and you've learned a brand new serve. You're going to apply some varied practice and space retrieval over the next week, but you'll stay with the foundations. You still will practice that same serve for muscle memory. You will use variation to change the spot you're aiming at. You'll mix the new serve with old serves, and you're going to mentally rehearse and review your game before, after, and during a game in practice. What I'm saying is these principles I've presented here can be applied to both cognitive thinking as well as physical things. That thing that you're thinking about at the very beginning of what I started talking, that thing you wanted to learn, you can apply all these principles to no matter what it is, cooking, cleaning, whatever, okay? So the last thing I want to highlight is that the reality is we know far less about how to learn than we should, at least in my view in comparison with astronomical sciences and medicine. I also want to practice what I preach, so if you found what I said interesting and you want to review this and look back on it, I've made a QR code and a link that you can access right now. But what I've presented is, in reality, just a small snapshot of what we do and we don't know, which is why I ask all of you to move past and beyond value judgments and stories we say about what effective or good learning is, and actually, much like we base medicine in science, we too should be basing learning in science. Thank you very much.